I'm Ernst Zündel with another Voice of Freedom program. Tonight we have as a guest Michael Hoffman II, an author of 4 books, numerous newsletters. He's also a researcher. Mike Hoffman, you have written a controversial book about They Were White and They Were Slaves.
Yes.
How did you come to write this book?
Well, originally I came across a book on white servitude in Virginia by a man named J.C. Bala, and I became very intrigued by his idea that white servitude was not limited to this juvenile kind of sophomoric notion that's pushed in high school, that persons of white background who were put into so-called indentured servitude had a very privileged type of bondage, and that that bondage was very temporary, and then it was ended after a period of 4 or 7 years, and they re-entered the ruling class and went about the job of exploiting black people. J.C. Bala, it's a very thin book of about 100 pages, I believe, raised the point that there were some aspects of white servitude that were consonant with slavery. And so that raised a red flag in my mind. Bala is deceased. It was an older book from, I believe, the 1930s, circa 1930s. And it stimulated something inside of me to say, if one man could say this, maybe others have said it.
No, of course, this kind of white indentured labor is nothing new to Europeans, because in the former Soviet Union or under Tsars in Russia, people basically were serfs, and serfs were tantamount to white slaves. Is there a difference?
There is a difference, I think, in the sense that in Russia, serfdom was very much a formal codified institution. In fact, there were 2 forms of serfdom. One was the bondage to the land, and the other was part of a formal Russian bureaucracy which existed inside the government and had a tremendous record-keeping process. So there was a difference in terms of serfdom itself within Russia, but of course in the larger sense of, were these people slaves? And by slaves I define it as lifetime bondage, bondage unto death. Yes, they were. And I think it's astute of you to say that this is nothing new, because of course enslavement of all people and all races has always been a phenomenon in history. We can go back to ancient Greece and ancient Rome, where there was always a slave class comprised of white people as well as of other races. We find this in the sections of the Icelandic and Viking sagas in terms of the phrase thrall. You know, nowadays we say you're enthralled to someone. They have a mental power over you. In that era, it meant a physical power over you. And of course, the Bible, contrary to what humanistic misinterpreters of Christianity have alleged, the Bible fully sanctions enslavement. We have had a mistranslation of the King James Bible which says, servants, be faithful unto your masters, in Ephesians. But in the original Greek it says, or connotes, the word would be the Latin servus, which means slave, slaves, be faithful unto your masters. So there is no New Testament or Old Testament prohibition against slavery. In the Old Testament, the prohibition is one of qualification, which is to say, if you are an Israelite, if you are a believer in the one true God of the Hebrews, then you can only be a bondsman to a fellow Hebrew for 7 years. Anything beyond 7 years, in the eyes of the ancient Israelites, was kidnapping. And that law was brought over to New England in the 17th century because the Puritans tried to keep the Old Testament law in that regard. But in the New Testament, in terms of enslaving people of a non-Christian Israelite background, I don't see that there was any limitation to that. Bringing you up through the Middle Ages, through the thraldom of the Icelandic era and so forth, we also have the Vikings conducting really a international trade in the capture and enslavement of white people. Irish, Norwegians, the Danes would capture the Norwegians in battle and sell them. And actually there became a capital along the coast of Spain where the Vikings would meet with Arab slavers and sell whites that they had captured and raided to Arabia. And so you have that. And then also in the Middle Ages, you have a phrase that's very interesting in terms of modern usage called villainage or villains, V-I-L-L-E-I-N-S, which would have been a French Carolinian term and then became anglicized as our modern-day bad guy, villain, V-I-L-L-A-I-N. And what I found in the course of my research is there was a persistent demonization of poor white people. In other words, in many eras in white society, if you were poor, it was tantamount to being a criminal. And that criminalization was then a connotation for making you a slave. And this slavery, by the way, this villainage, even was hereditary. In the chronicles that I read and in the accounts that I read, there was a almost biological taint on children of parents who had been white slaves or villains. So to summarize, I would say that the enslavement of whites, far from being a very brief period in the annals of time, was in fact the universal experience of whites. So now we come to the modern period, and we have this absurd stereotype which denotes black skin with servitude. And it's absurd. It's a folly. So I'm bringing the good news to black people that they are not of any more of a slave race than whites have been. And I'm also bringing good news to white people to say, you don't owe anybody anything. At least not the majority of white people don't. Perhaps the British aristocracy does. Perhaps those who were the heirs of codifying and institutionalizing white slavery in the United States are. However, they were a lot more politic about how they codified it, because in many of the New England rules and regulations for servitude, it would say that this had to be biblical. It had to be limited to 7 years. And that's where we hear in our high school history classes, when they give their minute and a half to this subject, they'll say, well, you can't compare white bondage to black slavery because the whites didn't do very difficult work and the enslavement was all over with within 7 years. No way. There were many loopholes and abuses of that law. As you and I know, there can be a law on a piece of paper. That doesn't mean that that's what's lived or brought into action. And for example, if you were a white slave and you did work that was unsuitable, or if you tried to run away, how were they penalized? In some cases by whippings, very onerous whippings. I have found accounts of almost fatal doses of whippings. There's been the recent firestorm of hysteria about this Jewish teenager who was to be caned in Singapore. I believe it was 7 cane strokes, and he was ultimately administered 4. Well, white slaves had to endure hundreds of lashes, and many of them died of that. But another way of penalizing them was to add time onto their length of service. If you ran away a day, that was a month of additional service. If you ran away for a month, that was a year of additional service. If you stole from your master, that could be months of additional service. If you had a corrupt master, and the courts of assize listened more to the master than they did to you, he could have all kinds of trumped up charges against you, as happened in the Caribbean, and has happened in the United States in the tobacco plantations, and it meant that in reality it boiled down to a lifetime of enslavement under the euphemism of indentures.
Now, were these people allowed to marry and have children?
No. A white woman who had a child out of wedlock because she was not allowed to marry, so any child she did have would be out of wedlock. If it was a male child, that child became a slave until the age of majority, and the age of majority was 21 for males, and a female issue from that woman would be a slave unto that woman's master until the white child was 18.
Now, where did these slaves come from? Where were they drawn from?
Well, primarily from Great Britain. It was remarked in one of the chronicles that I found that Scotland was a veritable industry for white slavery. In the 17th century, white parents were afraid to bring their children to the ports of Scotland for fear of what has come to be known as press gangs. Again, the historians have distorted this and implied that impressment only operated for recruiting people on board British men of war as sailors. That's not true. In the original annals, you find that press gangs operated to kidnap children and adults on board these ships, and it was a veritable industry with the cooperation of the authorities It began in the very early or the very late Elizabethan era, when the Elizabethan geographer Halkut suggested that the only way they were going to people these plantations was with bondsmen. But the actual machinery of it and where it was really put into effect en masse came in the Stuart dynasty and under the King Charles I in the early 17th century.
Now, that is not exactly a nice part of Western history then.
Well, it is in a sense that it may be an indictment of the ruling class, but if you study the heroism of the white slave, I don't think that it is necessarily a depressing chronicle, because these people had tremendous spirit. And in the end, the reason why the slavers in the British America switched from whites to blacks is that white slaves were virtually in constant rebellion. As I chronicle in my book, they were white and they were slaves. There were really countless rebellions against bondage. And after a while, when they had a large enough black population in colonial America, they figured we better switch from the whites to the blacks. Now, I'm not suggesting that was a general, coincidental, synchronistic decision that all of them made together as kind of a cabal or a conspiracy. It was nothing so conspiratorial. It was very informal. But in general, there was a perception that whites were much more independent and rebellious than the blacks.
Now, this kind of indentured labor force, was it freed when America gained its independence and the British lost kind of the right to rule, or when did this practice end?
They were not granted their freedom under the United States Constitution, because there is a reference in the Constitution to bondsmen of unspecified races. And there were still people profiting from white bondage. What did end with the beginning of the American Revolutionary War against the British Crown was transportation, which is a technical term used by the British for bringing so-called white criminals from Britain and dumping them in the United States. Benjamin Franklin greatly protested that, and that was in fact one of the colonists' grievances. However, I believe that it was also an alibi, because the Waltham Black Act of 1723 had criminalized a great number of petty misdemeanors and made them capital offenses. In other words, Britain was teeming with a white population of poor people that it couldn't handle, and it needed to get them off the island. So by criminalizing these petty offenses, you were then able to say, we sentence you to death. However, as for stealing a teaspoon, or a loaf of bread, or cutting down trees on an aristocrat's grounds, or poaching a deer. However, as a mercy of the British Crown, we will transport you for life into slavery in the British Crown colony of America. When the American Revolution erupted, the British Crown then had to switch their dumping ground from America to Australia, and that's how Australia was founded. However, servitude is a vast subject. We're only dealing with one aspect of it, because after all, as I believe you remarked to me, you yourself were involved in an indenture program as a young man in Germany.
That's right.
And you didn't feel that it was unfair. You benefited from it. You got some experience and knowledge. So the system of apprenticeship, I believe, can be biblical. It can have integrity. And I feel the way our educational system is going in modern times, that it would be provident to bring back a kind of apprentice system. And certain fortunate whites, as well as fortunate blacks, because there were also free blacks who owned whites, free blacks who owned blacks, and blacks who were involved in an indentured system that was very humane and legitimate, that I'm outlining here. So it's a much more complex topic. But I do sanction the idea of an apprentice system where a person trades sometime in their life for a humane circumstance of room and board, and perhaps a stipend, if not a living wage, because you're living, after all, on the abundance of your master, and you in turn learn a skilled craft. So I'm not condemning the system of apprenticeship, but rather the abuse and indeed the Holocaust, which in the name of apprenticeship and in the name of a temporary, biblically based bondage, destroyed hundreds of thousands of white lives in the most heinous circumstances imaginable.
Now, when we talk about slavery, of course, to me this is mostly new. When we talk about slavery, we talk about these crowded ships coming over from Africa with people dying of diseases, people being kept in the holds of these primitive ships. Was it the same for whites?
It was worse for whites because the ships were not designed to carry human cargo as the slave ships were. They were designed to carry cargo, period, which could be horses, it could be rum, it could be lumber. These ships exhibited a higher rate of fatality for white slaves, as I document in my book, in the Middle Passage, as it's known, than existed for black slaves.
Another topic that you raise is that Indians, North American Indians, actually had slaves.
Yes, the so-called civilized tribes, the Cherokee and the Choctaw, had slave plantations, and they kept black slaves on those plantations in the South. And this is where the black cowboy phenomenon comes that's now being celebrated as we speak on U.S. 29-cent stamps. The idea that black people had a share in the winning of the West, which racist movie directors in Hollywood have excluded from a fair account of this. Well, in actuality, it is true that blacks were a part of the conquest of the West. However, the part they played was largely punitive as a result of their role as U.S. cavalry soldiers punishing the American Indians. And ironically, because many of these black soldiers were these so-called buffalo soldiers, had been slaves of the Indians, they didn't really have a high opinion or a very lovable relationship with those Indians. So they were more than willing to participate in the Union Generals' War, and that's largely what the American war against the Indians was in the postbellum period, a war conducted by Union generals like Phil Sheridan and William Tecumseh Sherman with black troopers in their midst and in their ranks. And therefore, these Choctaw and Cherokee Indians, by the way, also had fought on the Confederacy. There were Confederate generals who were full-blooded Cherokee Indians because the Cherokee Indian identified with the white slaveholders who held blacks in bondage because Cherokee Indians also had plantations and also held blacks in bondage.
Incredible story, an incredible story. Now, how about this thing that there were free blacks that had white slaves?
Oh, yes. The early 17th century experience in America was one of, you would say, Reagan capitalism really prevailed in the 17th century in America. It was pretty much a capitalist domain, and it was an unregulated domain. And the idea that there was an ideology of white supremacy, which always protected poor white people and always gave them a higher station or status than blacks, is a tissue of falsehood. Because if you study the status of white slaves in Great Britain prior to the colonization and peopling of North America, you find that they were synonymous with a type of subhuman. That was the ideology of the ruling class in Great Britain. Now, that ideology didn't suddenly stop as soon as they confronted the experience of colonization in America. It was carried over. So there was a sense among the British aristocracy, who were now the governors of the crown colonies in British America, that if blacks were holding some individual whites in slavery or bondage, well, what the heck? These were, after all, poor whites, and this was their natural state. To the credit, I certainly don't wish to indict all wealthy whites. I'm not engaged in a class warfare here. I come from a family that had a fairly affluent background, so I don't have any axe to grind. It's just that this is what the facts, the documentary record, the empirical facts speak, and I must therefore be the vessel of their articulation. But there was finally a law passed. If you look at Henning's history of the statutes of Virginia, they actually had to pass a law saying that no black or Indian shall hold a Christian in bondage. Well, Christian was a euphemism for white person. So that's one of the pieces of evidence that we know. Because, you know, they came to be very ashamed and embarrassed. The record of white enslavement is not something that they wanted to broadcast to the world. It was something that existed in a kind of an anomalous and ambiguous fashion, and one has to hunt these things out. Now, I'm not saying that it's something that was in code, but if we see a law that says no Indian or black shall hold Christians in bondage, we have to understand that these were people who were very reluctant to pass a great deal of laws. The people at that time felt, those who were religiously inclined, felt that the Ten Commandments were plenty of laws. If they passed a law, you can be sure that it was because there was a need for it.
Mm-hmm. Now, why is this not being known more widely in America? Why is this being swept under the rug?
I think that to a certain degree, Ernst, there is a function here of consensus reality that tends to prevail in human beings. I do not have a high opinion of human nature. And I think that humanity, more often than not, has a sheep-like, cow-like, bovine nature to itself. And since the received opinion is that blacks were slaves and whites were always the wealthy overseers, people don't tend to rock the boat. Now, people whose profession it is to look into this matter, university historians and academicians whose job it is to investigate and sift history, have this function of political correctness, which impinges on their tenure, their salaries, and indeed their relationship to the community. So if they begin to explore a politically incorrect area, then of course they may be subject to sanction. Secondly, we have a gigantic industry in the United States and in the West which is determined to limit black people to a slave mentality, to tell them you've been slaves, and the only way you're ever going to get out of that is to rely on the slave mentality of the socialistic welfare democratic system, which is going to subsidize your manumission ever further. Well, as we know, no one ever gets out of his own bondage by someone else doing it for you. It's by your own work that you bring yourself out of bondage. Because certainly white slaves were the ones who freed themselves by their own unruliness and their own rebelliousness. Unfortunately, in the chronicle of black history, we do have to adduce the fact that the Nat Turner Rebellion was one of the few great black rebellions in the South, along with Toussaint L'Ouverture in Haiti. There were very few. But there is this mentality to impose this, and of course then we have the Martin Luther King industry, the civil rights industry. So that represents a phenomenal weight, a huge weight pressing down on people. I do think, though, that my book, in its own subtle kind of guerrilla way, I say subtle because only 5,000 copies have been sold. We're sort of a samizdat press ourselves. I do think that it's beginning to percolate down into the halls of academy.
Is there not a good message here that one can say to blacks and to whites, look, you are not on opposite ends of a spectrum. You actually have a common shared experience, because undoubtedly many of the working class whites, the descendants of working class whites in America, are therefore descendants of white slavery as the blacks were of black slavery.
Absolutely, and especially in Appalachia, where you had the phenomenon of the so-called border southern whites, the whites who peopled West Virginia, Tennessee, and Kentucky. People like Andrew Johnson, who became a president of the United States. He was vice president under Lincoln. Andrew Johnson had been an indentured servant. He was an apprentice tailor. He was treated brutally. He ran away. I don't consider him a white slave in the technical sense, because by that period in America's history, it had moved into, as a mass phenomenon, into something that was more a temporary bondage. However, nevertheless, you did have the fact that a reward was posted for him. For a president of the United States as a young man, a reward was posted, a wanted poster was issued, and he had to flee the state of Tennessee. He went on to become vice president, and after Lincoln was assassinated, president of the United States. But there was an independent group of Americans living in those mountain border regions who were unwilling to fight for the Confederacy, not because they were scalawags who sided with the blacks, but because in a sense they were ultra-nationalistic whites who didn't want to lift a finger for the planter aristocracy in the South, who, poor white people felt, treated blacks better than they did poor whites. So yes, there is a unity and a common heritage not only between blacks and whites, but between all people on this earth in the sense of servitude. I certainly don't believe in a new world order or one big world, but I'm talking about in terms of this experience. And out of that we can understand that there has been a terrible distortion of history, and really an indictment of our historians for allowing this absurdity to hold forth, that there has been one race that has been enslaved more than the others. That may be the modern sense since 1840. It is certainly not the sense of the entire corpus of world history. In fact, the opposite has held true. Whites have been enslaved to the same extent or more than blacks.
Mike Hoffman, a very interesting topic, a very unusual topic, and undoubtedly not very much discussed by the media that is basically bringing only politically correct subjects. I hope that people at colleges and so on will invite you, and I hope that people who see the program will go and get in touch with you. A very interesting, fascinating, sad, interesting topic. Ernst Zündel here for another Voice of Freedom.